What's going on, guys? This is going to be another Star Wars Unlimited commentated gameplay video. This time I am playing Luke Skywalker and I'm playing against Tremble here, who is running Han Solo. We are both playing the new Tarkintown base, a 25 HP base that allows you to deal 3 damage to a damaged non-leader enemy unit as an epic action. Or I think it might not be enemy unit. I think you might be able to do it to a friendly damage unit if you wanted to, but that seems a little niche. I am running Luke Skywalker. My opponent's running Han Solo. We're having a rebel training exercise or whatever. So I'm gonna start off here by playing Sabine Wren. My opponent plays C-3PO, gets to guess a 3, does indeed hit a 3-cost card, and draws a copy of Rogue Operative. So I take the initiative, and here I have some options. I think that playing my Fleet Lieutenant will allow Sabine to defeat C-3PO immediately. And that seems to be what I'm thinking here, clear my opponent's unit while also developing my own board. That's one big advantage of the Fleet Lieutenant, as opposed to I could also play the open fire to kill C-3PO, but that wouldn't develop my board. Playing the Fleet Lieutenant allows Sabine to defeat C-3PO, use her ability to deal 1 damage to the base. You may attack with the unit. If it's a rebel unit, it gets +2/+0. That's the Fleet Lieutenant. Then Sabine has on attack, you may deal 1 damage to the defender or to a base. So Sabine has only 2 attack base, but she gets +2 from the Fleet Lieutenant, enough to defeat the 4 HP C-3PO in one go. And then I can use her ability to deal 1 damage to the enemy base. My opponent plays Fighters for Freedom, a newly previewed card, 3 cost 3/4 with Saboteur. And when you play another red card, it deals 1 damage to the enemy base. I take the initiative. So overall, pretty favorable situation for me, or so it seems. But but my opponent, mulling it over, I think ends up deciding to use Tarkintown here to defeat my Sabine and make this board state a little more even, and that's exactly right. So Tarkintown, epic action, deal 3 damage to a damaged non-leader unit. So that's going to defeat Sabine and make it so that I don't have the numerical advantage that I did earlier. So looking at my hand here, I think I decide that I'm probably going to play out my own copy of the Fighters for Freedom and shield them with Luke. I can lead things off, potentially dealing some damage with the Fleet Lieutenant before my opponent clears them. I could also, in theory, have kept the restored arc that I ended up resourcing, played entrenched on my Fleet Lieutenant, tried to clear the Fighters for Freedom with the entrenched Lieutenant, and then also played the restored arc. That might have been a better play. We'll have to see. But, you know, I end up deciding I'm just going to go straight for the enemy base. That's 3 damage there. My opponent can, of course, clear out my unit easily, but I've now put myself in a position where I have that. I at least got the hit in, and if my opponent takes a bunch of damage to clear my unit, I could potentially kill him with my own Tarkintown, or he could just be in a position to be defeated by later attacks. My opponent plays a Rogue Operative, kind of a scary unit. Rogue Operative is a 2/4, and it has Raid 2, so it gets +2 when attacking. And additionally, it has Saboteur, so when it attacks, it defeats the opponent's shields. I play my own Fighters for Freedom. So the Rogue Operative, Saboteur, and Raid 2. It is a Rebel and Trooper, 3 cost 2/4. So in this situation, there's actually an interesting dynamic, which is that I do not want to shield my Fighters for Freedom, even though that had kind of been my game plan going into the turn. Because my opponent's units have Saboteur, if I use Luke's action to shield them right now, all that will happen is my opponent will take the initiative and then attack before me and clear my stuff out. Not what I want to see. So I take the initiative instead, and it's going to be a situation that might be a little different than normal Luke gameplay. Normally, you really want to be giving out those shields with Luke's leader ability, but against Saboteur units, it's kind of a liability. Like, all it would do is make me lose some tempo. My opponent could just attack with the Rogue Operative, clear my unit, and remove the shield. I do think that the alternate line of play with the entrenched and the restored arc might have been better than what ended up happening that turn. So I got 3 damage on the enemy base, but then I realized that the shield that I could have given out wouldn't have actually been good into those saboteurs, so I didn't get value out of that other resource. I think if I had gone for the entrenched and the restored arc, that might have been a better turn. Oh well, that's how it goes sometimes. You don't always see the best line at the time. And so this time I'm going to lead off by playing my open fire, dealing 4 damage to my opponent's rogue operative and clearing that out, and then 1 damage to the enemy base from the Fighters for Freedom ability. And this then means my Fighters for Freedom can potentially remove his or can hit his base for an additional 3 damage. However, my opponent does the same thing that I just did to him. A open fire clears that unit. I end up deciding, you know what, I'm going to use Tarkintown and get that guy off the board. I had hoped to maybe play out the entrenched this turn or do something like that, but it's not going to happen. And so now my opponent has the opportunity to deploy Han and do some damage to me. Now the thing about Han is he says he deploys when you have 6 resources or more, but because his ability gives you a resource temporarily, when you're at 5 resources, you can use it, get that resource onto the board, and then actually deploy Han, even though he would normally only deploy at 6. So he really comes out on the 5 resource turn rather than the 6 resource turn. And indeed, that's just what my opponent does. I've taken the initiative at this point. My opponent attacks and deals 4 damage to the base, and then plays a Wampa. With the bonus resource from attacking with Han, Wampa is a 4 cost for 5, I believe, and has Overwhelm. Not the greatest unit, but I do think it will be at least a decent card in limited. As it stands, 4 cost for 4/5 isn't horrible, but just having Overwhelm and not having good traits is not that great. Like you can compare that to a card like Kanan Yaris or Jaris or however you pronounce that, who is 4 cost 4/5, has the Force trait, has the Rebel trait. Those are really good traits, and his ability is probably better than Overwhelm. So the Wampa does seem a little bit behind, but it is also a red only card, so you can play it in both a heroic or a villainous deck. And I do think it is going to be strong in the limited environment. So we're resourcing out. My opponent has to discard his temporary resources that he had from Han. I am going to hopefully get a chance to get Luke onto the field this turn, and it looks like my game plan is probably going to be Luke plus Obi-Wan. There is a risk that my opponent will have some card to immediately remove Obi-Wan. So like a surprise strike right now from his Wampa would kill Obi-Wan and deal 1 damage to my base, and I wouldn't have the chance to put any experience on it. Also, a Waylay would be very bad, but if he doesn't have a good answer to my Obi-Wan, it's going to be a big problem for him. So Obi-Wan Kenobi gets thrown onto the board. Additionally, there's not all that much else I can do. I mean, I guess I could immediately play Luke and hope to get Luke's lightsaber and or entrenched on him for some big value, but not guaranteed to work out well for me. My opponent hits Obi-Wan with the Wampa. I deploy Luke. My opponent now has to do some sort of damage to Obi-Wan, whether that be with Han or some ability or something, or else Luke has the opportunity to attack and give Obi-Wan a shield. However, he has a little trick there. Leia Organa Defiant Princess exhausting Luke when he deploys, so I won't get a chance to attack with Luke. I take the initiative. My opponent then does have Han defeat Obi-Wan. I put 2 experience tokens on Luke and draw a card. So Obi-Wan has, when defeated, grant 2 experience tokens to a friendly unit. If it's a Force unit, draw a card. So I do get 2 experience and a card draw off of Obi-Wan, as well as having done some damage to my opponent or to my opponent's units. However, he then plays another Wampa, so the experienced Luke Skywalker is staring down a pretty dangerous set of units there. However, we're going to see here. I have 7 resources, so we're going to see how Luke does with some backup from Mace Windu. My opponent resources up, then discards a card from his Han Solo temporary resource thing. I have a big card advantage in hand, but his board is very strong. Mace Windu on the field. Mace Windu defeats my opponent's Han immediately, taking 4 damage and then standing up. So Mace has ambush, and when he defeats an enemy unit, he can ready. So potentially here we could see like under ideal circumstances here, Mace Windu could actually defeat 3 enemy units. So I can defeat Han, and then if my opponent doesn't immediately kill Mace Windu, I can defeat Leia, and then if my opponent doesn't do something about that, I could defeat the wounded Wampa. Alternatively, I could send Luke to attack somebody and put a shield on Mace Windu, but I'm not going to get a chance to do that because my opponent swings in with the wounded Wampa, defeating Mace Windu and I believe doing 1 excess damage to the base as well. I have Luke just hit the enemy base directly. That's going to be 6 damage to the enemy base. So my opponent has 6 damage on the board. My Luke here actually has 9 health thanks to the experience. So he'll need to have some sort of other trick if he wants to defeat Luke. Unfortunately, I don't have any unit to back up Luke and give him a shield. So my opponent's Wampa swings into Luke. Luke defeats the Wampa, of course. I take the initiative, and I think then an open fire or something comes out. No, he actually plays his own Mace Windu and defeats my Luke, taking 6 damage. So only 1 life left, but he's still a powerful card there. And additionally, is going to be able to attack my base for 5 damage and then 2 more from Leia. So both bases getting low. My opponent's units on the board are quite low life, but he does have Mace Windu there for some potential big damage. It's an interesting situation. We're going to see if I can try and stabilize things. If you hear me sniffing or coughing a bit, I'm coming off a cold when I record this. Sorry about that, guys. I play a quick takedown to defeat Mace Windu. So takedown 4 cost card, defeat a unit with 5 or less remaining HP. Mace only had 1 HP, so that will in fact defeat him cleanly. And then I'm going to hope to play out my Fighters for Freedom and give them a shield with Luke's ability. I erroneously have Luke exhausted here. That's not correct. I do have a Takedown, a Vanquish, and a copy of Luke's Lightsaber in hand, which will hopefully allow me to defeat any powerful units my opponent might play out. Leia hits my base for 2. I then give the shield to my Fighters for Freedom. My opponent takes the initiative. Okay. We're going into a relatively late game here, despite us both playing aggro bases with only 25 life and the aggression cards in both decks. We are now at, I think, 8 resources. It's been been quite a slugfest of a game here. Both bases starting to get a bit low, though. My opponent does have the initiative. A wing leader to buff up my Fighters for Freedom here could be kind of scary. The Fighters for Freedom can, of course, attack and defeat Leia if I wanted to. I could play this copy of Sabine Wren, doing 1 free damage, but I think I end up deciding I actually want to resource that copy of Sabine Wren. This way, at 9 resources, I can potentially do some more stuff. My opponent plays Chewie. So Chewie is a 3/6 Sentinel, and when attacked, he readies. So potentially, if my Fighters for Freedom were to attack Chewie, he would ready up and be able to hit my base. I play the Wing Leader, buffing the Fighters for Freedom. Now a 5/6 with a shield, and additionally with Saboteur, I can sneak past Chewie's defenses there, hit the enemy base directly, or defeat Leia if I wanted to. However, my opponent plays a Waylay, sending the Fighters for Freedom back to my hand. Not what I wanted to see. I replay the Fighters for Freedom. Leia hits my base for 2 damage, I believe. I arguably should have used the Fighters for Freedom to just defeat Leia immediately, and then put the experience tokens later or whatever. But in this case, I'm going to shield them and give them Luke's lightsaber. So now a 6/5 with a shield. Luke's lightsaber is an interesting card. It's obviously super great if you play it on Luke and heal him, but it also has quite a strong impact when played on some of the higher HP heroic units. Sometimes playing it on R2D2 or C3PO, for instance, can be a pretty scary play. My opponent uses the old asteroid sanctuary to exhaust my fighters for freedom and shield Leia. Not what I wanted to see. I vanquished Chewie, defeating him outright. Want to get that cleared up. Leia attacks my base for 2. This Leia has been doing some real damage. Just a basic unit that has been causing me some trouble. I play a wing leader and give 2 experience tokens to my other wing leader, only to have it shot down by an open fire. I'll then use Luke's ability to shield the wing leader that is still on the board, the one that I just played. My opponent takes the initiative. I'm drawing into a lot of space stuff here. At 9 resources, I think I've decided to call it quits on resourcing more cards. So my opponent's Leia attacks and defeats the shield on my Fighters for Freedom. We do a shield trade here. I hit the enemy base with the Fighters for Freedom, 6 damage. My opponent then sends in Han Solo, defeating the Fighters for Freedom. So now the ground arena is pretty firmly in my opponent's hands. I do have some space options available. I can actually play Kanan, the Starwing Scout, and the Restored Arc, putting me in with a pretty strong board. The question, though, is whether my opponent is going to have some trick to have Han coming in with bonus damage, so Fleet Lieutenant wouldn't work, but if he has Shoot First or Surprise Strike, he can actually just kill my base in one attack. He takes the initiative here, so I'm deploying these units. I now have probably a substantial advantage, assuming my opponent doesn't have a trick to just immediately win. But we will see what happens here. I believe that, unfortunately for me, there's the shoot first. So with 1 bonus damage from Han, he deals the 7 damage that he needs to win the game. My strong space fleet does not avail me much. Interesting situation there. I think that I probably should have removed that Leia Organa sooner. It was kind of doing some damage to my base. I could have taken it out with the Saboteur ability from the Fighters for Freedom, and it probably would have been in my interest to do that, but he kept exhausting me or causing some trouble or another. And then I was thinking, I just want to push damage to his base, but that didn't end up going great for me. That Han snuck in, and even though I had that strong space fleet that could have, in theory, won the game that turn, was not to be. All right, we're going to go to round 2. That was a good close game. Ultimately, a defeat for me. And we're gonna see if I can do better going into this next round. Same decks, same matchup. This time I will go first. A common little etiquette thing if you're doing a match with the same decks playing multiple times is that whoever lost the last game gets initiative this game. Just a common little etiquette thing in this game, and I believe some others as well. All right. Han versus Luke, Showdown at Tarkintown, round two. Once again, I start the game with Sabine Wren. She was a strong opening play for me last time, and my opponent ended up using Tarkintown early on to defeat her. Let's see what she can do this time. My opponent actually uses Han's ability here, sacrificing one of his initial cards to get the ability to play a 3-cost unit, which ends up being a Starwing Scout. I take the initiative, and we are off to the next turn. I have a really solid card in hand here, which is the Wing Leader. I'm going to be able to play that out. So that's not only will give me a 2/1 ship, which could potentially trade with my opponent's Starwing Scout. It will also be uh, a +2/+2 for Sabine Wren. I end up deciding, okay, we're going to resource C-3PO because I have this Wing Leader now. I have Kanan next turn. I'm kind of playing on curve. I don't need to like play cheaper stuff. So there's the Wing Leader buffing up Sabine Wren with +2 with 2 experience counters for +2/+2. Wing Leader, an outstanding card. 3-cost 2/1 when played, grant 2 experience tokens to another friend and the Rebel unit. Sabine is a Rebel. Now, in the future, this card might get better as we see more Rebel cards. I could also see, maybe we see a lot of really good cards that you want to play that aren't Rebels, and you end up getting your trait synergy diluted. In this deck, I think all my units other than Obi-Wan and the Starwing Scout are Rebels, so I have a lot of targets for the Wing Leader. My opponent ends up playing Ezra Bridger. 3-cost, that 3/4, when he attacks, he can look at your top card and you can choose to play it, put it back on top, or discard it. I'm thinking about whether I would like to attack the enemy base or attack Ezra. So the base would be like kind of the racing option, but I end up deciding, no, I'd rather just clear Ezra, deal 1 damage to the base with Sabine's ability. And my opponent uses Tarkintown here to defeat Sabine. I then take the initiative. The Starwing Scout will hit my base for 4. So I defeated Ezra there. I got my opponent to use Tarkintown to clear my Sabine, and now I have the initiative. So Starwing Scout, that space unit my opponent has, is a 3-cost 4/1. And when defeated, if you have the initiative, you draw 2 cards. But with me having the initiative, my opponent's my opponent's Starwing Scout doesn't have that card draw enabled. I trade with my Wing Leader. My opponent plays the Wampa, 4-cost 4/5 Overwhelm. I play Kanan. I was mentioning earlier, Kanan is a 4-cost with the same stat line and a better ability. So I am happy to have my Wampa facing off with Kanan in this situation. My opponent takes the initiative, and we're going on to turn 5. This is going to be an important turn because Han Solo can deploy this turn. Entrenched looks like it could be a really strong option here. If I entrench my copy of Kanan, my opponent will not be able to deploy Han without Kanan being able to just defeat him. It would also put Kanan in a position where if my opponent didn't deploy Han, I would be able to defeat the Wampa with 1 attack. I want to so one disadvantage of Han is that if you do play him on the 5-resource turn and you use his ability to go to 6 resources and then deploy him early, this is like a very telegraphed play because you have to spend an action to give yourself the bonus resource, which does mean that the opponent can kind of slow roll you and like have the right thing potentially set up to answer you. So if he could just deploy Han immediately, he could have done it before I was able to play this copy of Entrenched. But as it stands, he is not able to do that. He uses the resource, so I know Han is potentially going to be sent in next. Then I play the entrenched, +3/+3, but can't attack bases. So my Kanan is now a 7/8 and can't attack bases. If my opponent deploys Han, Kanan will be able to kill him in one hit. And if my opponent does now, one thing my opponent could do here is pass in the hopes that I will kill the Wampa and then he can deploy Han and not be threatened. But if my opponent passes here, I'm actually just going to take the initiative because that means that Han will not deploy. So if you take the initiative as the response to a pass, that just ends the turn. So that would mean that my opponent would not spend his resources this turn, Han would not deploy, and it would put me into a strong position going into the next turn, having the initiative for my Starwing Scout, and for Kanan to potentially make an attack on that turn or potentially do something else. I could also just bring out Luke as my first action on that turn. There would be a lot of choices available to me. It would really be pretty good. So my opponent is mulling over the situation. I don't know what he has in hand, but I guess based on his behavior, I'm just assuming that he doesn't have a card like Waylay that could just remove this Kanan back to my hand. And as a result of that, I think it's going to be one of these situations where he's choosing, do I want to have Han go out there and probably get killed in order to set things up to get rid of this cannon later and allow me to take the initiative? Or do I want to try and pass and bring him out later? He ends up bringing out Han, which is unfortunate, but might be better in this situation. Kanan's ability then mills my opponent's top card from the attack, and I gain life equal to the number of different aspects. I gain 1 life in that situation. And my opponent then plays an open fire, defeating Kanan. So I actually do get the chance to take the initiative here. Um, Overall, I think that's a very good exchange for me. My opponent does have the advantage in the ground arena and does have more life on the base. But with my opponent's leader already defeated, it's a kind of different scenario. Because I can bring out Luke this turn and potentially have a big impact with my leader, and my opponent's leader is not going to have much more impact on the game, though he could, of course, use his ability to get that bonus resource. I am down by 6 life, and the Wampa is a solid unit, but I'm going to lead off by deploying Obi-Wan Kenobi. So 6 cost 4/6, Force Jedi with Sentinel. When defeated, give 2 experience tokens to another friendly unit. If it's a Force unit, draw a card. So right now, that's going to stop his Wampa from hitting my base. It will, if he kills it, I can either give two experience tokens to my Starwing Scout, or if I can get Luke out by the relevant time, I can get 2 experience tokens on Luke and a card draw. My opponent uses Han's ability here. This is, I think, a bit of a misplay. I think that oh no, he did resource. He did resource. My mistake. My mistake. I thought he had not resourced and then used Han's ability, which would be kind of an error because it would have been better to have that resource permanently instead of temporarily. But so my opponent then sends in Han Solo the unit, defeating Obi-Wan Kenobi in 1 shot. However, this kind of opens him up because I then give the 2 experience to my Luke, drawing a card because Luke is a Force unit. Luke is now a 6 strength, 9 HP unit, and I will be able to attack and defeat Han. My Starwing Scout hits his base for 4. I'm kind of trying to gauge what he's going to do here. I want to see whether or not he's going to attack my Luke. He does not. Were he to attack Luke, there would be an argument for just taking the initiative and playing Luke's lightsaber at the start of the next turn. Not what he goes for. Ends up hitting the base. I defeat Han. And you might ask, why is it that you defeated Han instead of the standing Wampa before it attacked? The reason is Han would be able to, could take initiative and defeat Luke with Han on his first attack, because Han does not take. Han basically has shoot first built in the Han unit at least. Okay, so now my opponent has the initiative. Luke's ability shielded the Star Wing. He hits me with the Wampa, and the overwhelm from the Wampa pushes 1 damage through, because Luke had 9 life total, but 6 damage on him. So 4 damage. 1 was left over to go through with overwhelm. 13 to 20 life is in my opponent's advantage, but I have a shielded Starwing Scout, which is quite an asset to have on the field. I play a Fleet Lieutenant here and have my Starwing Scout attack for 4. Now, Fleet Lieutenant doesn't buff my Starwing Scout because the Starwing Scout is one of the 2 units in this build that is not a rebel, as I was discussing earlier. However, it is tempo advantage because I'm swinging in there and doing some damage, and additionally developing my board. I'm trying to ideally be in a situation where I'm going to be able to take the initiative while also developing my board. I want the initiative because the Starwing Scouts ability. Well, first off, I want the initiative because having the initiative is good. Um, but secondly, I want the initiative because the Starwing Scouts ability only applies while I have the initiative. My opponent then plays out a Rogue Operative, 3 cost 3/4 with Raid 2 and Saboteur. Quite dangerous little unit. I decide I don't want that out there. Play a Takedown and remove the Rogue Operative from the board. My opponent has 1 card left in hand. It is the Millennium Falcon. Millennium Falcon takes the field, 3 cost 3/4, and it enters play readied. But at the start of the action phase of your next turn, you have to pay 1 resource to keep it in. I think it's the start of the action phase. It might be after you ready stuff. It's something like that. You do get the chance to ready your resources before you have to pay, but it can potentially be an interesting option. And here, my opponent is going to be better off by not paying and then having it just go back to hand because and that's exactly what we see, because if he had paid to keep it in, not only would he be down the resource that he used to pay for it, I could attack and immediately kill it with my Starwing Scout. Whereas this way, he's going to have the opportunity to kind of outmaneuver me. Fleet Lieutenant swinging in for 3 damage to the enemy base here. Waylay then comes out, sending my Starwing back to hand. I replay the Starwing Scout. My opponent can now play the Millennium Falcon once again, and I no longer have a ready unit to defeat it before it attacks. I play another Starwing Scout. The Falcon hits my base for 3. I'm starting to get real low. Base down to 7 life. I play an R2D2. This was arguably a mistake. I think it might have been better to just take the initiative. I see a Fighters for Freedom, which I don't really want, and I do send it to the bottom of the deck. So I am getting I am getting an advantage in terms of what cards there are, but I've now guaranteed that his Falcon can hit my base a second time. So if I had instead taken the initiative here, my Starwing Scouts on defeat ability would be live, first of all. But then secondly, he would be forced to use that same trick to send the Falcon back to hand, or else one of my Starlings would attack, kill it, and draw 2 cards, which would be extremely favorable for me. And then if he did send the Falcon back to hand, I could potentially wait him out with a Starwing Scout still readied, which would then prevent him from playing it and hitting my base. I'm really worried about attacks getting into my base and heavily damaging me here, so I think that the R2D2 wasn't great. I was hoping to draw into a removal card that I could use on the Falcon, but I didn't get the chance to do that. My opponent does decide to keep the Falcon in play. He plays Chewie as his first action here, which is interesting. That does mean I think I decide that I'm going to just trade one of my Starlings for the Falcon, even though I don't get the card draw. I'm happy that he did not get to swing in there for another 3 damage on my base, because I'm really getting to like critical levels where it's close to dying in 1 hit if my opponent has something like Surprise Strike or Open Fire. The other Starwing Scout hits his base for 3. Now, my opponent is now repeatedly passing rather than taking the initiative. So the reason that he's passing is that if I attack Chewie, Chewie then readies. And if Chewie readies, he can then attack my base, assuming that my opponent has not taken the initiative. If my opponent does take the initiative, it ends his turn. So he loses that opportunity to use Chewie. I play out Obi-Wan. My opponent passes again. And in this sort of situation, Obi-Wan is now blocking Chewie from damaging the enemy base. I could just start attacking him here, but I think I decide that I want to shield Obi-Wan first. Now, my opponent's Chewie can actually be removed much more easily than it would appear because I haven't used Tarkintown yet. So that's kind of my consideration. So I'm going to shield my Obi-Wan. And I believe at this point, my opponent decides now I'm going to take the initiative because there's no, like, if the only thing Chewie can attack is a shielded Obi-Wan, I don't really want to attack, even if my opponent attacks into him and allows him to stand up. So instead, I'm going to take the initiative going into this next turn. And now I have to think, okay, I've lost the initiative. So do do I want to kill Chewie or not? I could attack with the Fleet Lieutenant, 3 damage to Chewie. He stands up but can't attack or do anything because my opponent has taken the initiative. At that point, I can use Tarkintown to clear Chewie, and then I can attack with R2-D2. Alternatively, I could just attack with R2-D2. R2 would take 3 damage but stay alive, do 1 damage to Chewie, and then have potentially the card filter still there. But I decide that it's better to kill him and have R2-D2 hit the base because I wouldn't have a way to kill Chewie in one hit on the next turn, and my opponent has the initiative. He could like clear out Obi-Wan's shield, and I wouldn't really have much gain. So I end up deciding to clear Chewie with the aid of Tarkintown. R2 hits the enemy base, 8 life to 7 life, but I have a strong board and a card advantage, and I believe I have more resources as well. So it's looking like a favorable situation for me in this round too. Tremble got me in round 1. Round 2 looking good. Thinking over the options, but I believe this is a situation where I can likely clear the board, clear him out this turn, unless he has some really good stuff. Ends up saying, you know what, that's it, good game. So Tremble concedes that one. It is now 1-1, and we're going to the 2 out of 3. Let's do that final match here. So a third confrontation at Tarkintown here, the rebel training exercise or whatever, Luke versus Han. Let's see how this goes. This time, my opponent will have the initiative, thanks to that same kind of gaming etiquette rule that I was discussing earlier with respect to the person who lost the last game in the series getting to just go first. And so I have this hand. It's a weird hand, but I decide that I'm going to keep it. And what I'm going to try to do here is push forward in space. So I don't have the initiative. I don't have a wing leader or a fleet lieutenant to give me a buff on my first turn unit. And my opponent can potentially be using Han here, and that is what we see. My opponent uses Han to put in a temporary resource, which signals that he's going to play a 3-cost unit. So it could be a Starwing Scout like he did previously, but he could also play something like Ezra. I decide I'm going to play in space. I play out a restored arc, and my opponent brings out the rogue operative. So I am happy to have a space unit here and take the initiative with that. I end up deciding, okay, so the Fighters for Freedom are a good card. The problem is the Rogue Operative can just attack and clear them. I end up deciding to resource Sabine, who's kind of a cheaper unit. So Rogue Operative has Raid 2, so 4 strength, 4 damage, whatever, on the attack. Not what you always want to see. So I'm just going to lead things off with my restored arc hitting the enemy base for 2. I was a little worried that he would just be killed by some removal card, so open fire in particular would just defeat me immediately. Could also conceivably see a waylay, though it wouldn't be a very high impact waylay. And so my restored arc sneaks in there for 2 damage. Might have been better to wait and play the other restored arc first. If I had played the other restored arc first, then, if my opponent were to swing into my base and I attacked with the first restored arc afterwards, I would get the chance to use the restore 1. So, might have been better to play it a little differently. Additionally, if he was going to play a removal, if I play the second restored arc and he then uses the removal on the first one, I can still use my remaining resource to shield the second one with Luke. Whereas now, if I play the second restored arc and my opponent is thinking about it correctly, he will use his removal card on that second one, denying me the opportunity to use a shield. So I think it probably would have been better to deploy the second restored arc rather than having the first one attack. My opponent actually passed there. I think hoping that I would play a ground unit that he could use his rogue operative to defeat. But I did not give him the satisfaction, instead fortifying my position in space. And unfortunately for my opponent, it looks like he actually doesn't have another play that round. It's just going to be hitting my base for 4 with the Rogue Operative, which to be fair is good, but you're ideally hoping to expand your board further. All right, 21 to 23 life. I am a little behind on life, but I think my board is superior. The 2 restored arcs, one with a shield, can attack his base for 4, just as his rogue operative can attack my base for 4. But I am less vulnerable to removal than he is, and additionally, I have restore 2 across my 2 restored arcs, which means that I can be putting life on my base. My opponent has the initiative this turn, but is, I believe, considering his resourcing choice. So this turn, I could use one thing I could do is I could play C3PO guess 2, hope to see my 3rd restored arc, which I could then play out into space, and it would be pretty awesome. Or hope to see R2 or something. Could potentially shield C3PO. Could put Luke's lightsaber on C3PO. My opponent plays the Millennium Falcon. So I decide I'm going to have my unshielded restored arc, which can be defeated in 1 hit by the Falcon, hit the enemy base, damaging it for 2 and restoring 1 hit point to my base. The Falcon then defeats the unshielded arc that just attacked, taking 2 damage in the process. I decide I don't want to give it the chance to go back to hand and essentially heal from that damage, so I'm going to have my other restored arc clear the Falcon. Also restoring 1 hit point to my base. My opponent only has 1 resource left, but still has the Rogue Operative. I'm not sure. He may have passed there. I'm not sure. I decide, yeah, we're going to play C3PO. We guess 2. It is a 2. I see a copy of Entrenched. Drawing that to hand. That could be a good card to play on C3PO, quite frankly. But my opponent decides, you know what, Rogue Operative, we're going to clear that out. And I then have the opportunity to take the initiative. I could also play Entrenched on my arc. I could use Tarkintown to clear my opponent's Rogue Operative. I decide I'm just going to take the initiative, see what we got there. R2, and it binds all things, not the greatest ever. So probably what I want to do this turn is I want to play out that Starwing Scout to put another threatening unit into space. And then perhaps I'll play R2 and shield him. It binds all things is probably going to be the resource card since I don't have Jedi and I don't have damage on the board. And I already have Luke's lightsaber to be an impressive reversal effect if I have some damage that sticks on Luke. First action, I decide I'm just going to use Tarkintown. Let's get rid of that rogue operative. Board is cleared. Tremble thinking about his options now. I do have the only unit on the board, and I am ahead on life, so that's pretty good. But my opponent has not used Tarkintown yet, and he will get the chance to deploy Han this turn. As we can see, he uses Han's leader ability, setting up that 6th resource, which will now allow him to deploy Han. I deploy R2D2, looking at my top card. It is Sabine Wren. That's a small unit. That's that I want more in the early game. I'm going to send it to the bottom of the deck. R2 kind of filtering and trying to get me closer to some of the better cards. Han takes the field. I'm going to spend a resource to shield R2. So Han can't just defeat R2 in one go, and I'll potentially be able to play the Entrenched on him or even Luke's lightsaber on him or something, depending on what happens. I'm hoping to create a situation that's going to be, a little more annoying for my opponents to deal with, if possible. My opponent knocks the shield off of R2 with Han. Does indicate there's a good chance that we have Mace Windu deploying to kill R2 and then hit my base. I have the restored arc swing in there, and indeed we see Mace Windu kill R2 and then stand back up. Now Han, the reason Han cleared the shield is because Mace Windu only gets to ready up if he defeats the unit he attacks. So he had to clear the shield so that Mace would actually defeat R2 instead of just knocking the shield off and then not getting to stand up. But he does defeat R2 and then swing into my base for another 5 damage. I did deploy the Starwing Scout. So now we're in a position where my ground arena is open, but I have the advantage in space. However, my opponent can now be pushing 8 damage to the base per turn. I can push 6 damage to his base plus 1 heal to my base, assuming neither of us kill any units. That is actually a trade that's in my opponent's favor. I'm going to throw down Obi-Wan Kenobi. My hope is that this is going to stall him in the ground arena. Then I can get out Luke Skywalker, potentially clear some of his units, or just push more damage through to his base. Obi-Wan is a really good card in a Luke deck. A lot of synergy there with Obi-Wan being able to be played the same turn that you can deploy Luke. You can then, if they kill Obi-Wan, you can put the experience from Obi-Wan dying onto Luke. It's just a very favorable situation. My opponent's mulling over the options here. Ends up throwing a copy of Waylay, sending Obi-Wan back to hand. So that is a definitely not something I'm very happy with. I would say it's a very negative development for me. I have my restored arc swing in for 2 damage to his base and 1 hit point healed. My opponent plays a rogue operative. I'm trying to kind of slow roll him here in the hopes that he'll attack my base with one of his units, thus making it so that he will not be able to attack Luke with both Han and Mace and then defeat Luke. My opponent's copy of Tarkintown still unused. I am getting him a little low on life here, but he has a very strong ground arena. Mace Windu hits my base for 5. I then say, okay, time to deploy Luke. Now that I know my opponent won't be able to defeat him this turn, he sends Han to hit Luke. Luke takes 4 damage, Han takes 4 damage. I could actually take the initiative here and then play Luke's lightsaber at the start of the next turn, which would be kind of sick. But I think I decide under the circumstances, it makes more sense for me to use Luke to defeat his rogue operative, thus keeping Luke alive with 1 life, giving a shield to one of my other units. And then also, it will likely force him to clear Luke with an attack, or else I'll be able to play Luke's lightsaber and get a huge reversal of fortune. In general, if you play Luke's lightsaber and get a big heal on Luke, as well as the shield and bonus stats, that's like one of the swingiest, biggest plays in the game. I've often seen it just lead someone to concede the game immediately, quite frankly. Yeah, so I have Luke take down the rogue operative down to just 1 life on Luke. But the thing is, at this point, if we're racing, I'm happy with my opponent having to spend some big attack to take down Luke. My opponent takes the initiative. I've shielded my Starwing Scout. We're both at 7 resources now. I have a Mace Windu in hand. I can replay Obi-Wan, of course. The thing that I'm worried about, though, is that my opponent has 7 resources. He did resource this turn, which probably means he has something that he can use. So that would be he might have another Mace Windu, or he might have Han Solo the unit. If I deploy Obi-Wan and he uses Han to immediately kill Obi-Wan, that could be a very negative reversal of fortune for me. So what I decide to do here is I'm going to try and I'm going to try and counterplay what he's doing. I'm not going to deploy Obi-Wan immediately. I'm going to push on the space arena here. He hits the base for 5. I hit his base for 3. Or I'm sorry, for 4 with the wing leader. He hits my base for 4. 7 life to 7 life. We're in the danger zone here. At this point, though, there's one big advantage that I have, which is having played against this opponent for 2 games, I believe at this point that he is not running Surprise Strike. And as a result of that, I don't think he can actually kill me in 1 hit. I think that he is not in a position to kill me in 1 hit. And because of that, so he has a unit with 4 strength and a unit with 5 strength. If he plays a shoot first, he could go to 5 or to 6 strength, which would still not kill my base in 1 hit. And additionally, he has a neither of his units are rebels, so he can't play Fleet Lieutenant on them in order to give them +2. So I decide what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to press my advantage in space and close out the game there. I play a Fleet Lieutenant, so now I can kill him in 2 attacks. We're going to see what he does here. So if he plays anything that doesn't threaten to kill me in 1 hit, I can just take the initiative. And if he takes the initiative, I'm going to be able to shield my wing leader and play a Star Wing Scout. And at that point, I already have a big advantage in space, but at that point, I have like way more than I need for lethal in space. So it is indeed going to be a Star Wing Scout and a shield after my opponent takes the initiative. And we're going into what is very likely the last turn of the game. Both sides have lethal on the board. So Obi-Wan would seem to be a good play here. Um, Now, arguably, I could have played the wing leader last turn before I attacked with the restored arc. That would then put me in a position where my opponent would be at only 5 life, which would then mean that if I played Obi-Wan and he did immediately kill him, I would get 2 experience on um, either of my Starwing Scouts or on my Restored Arc, and they would then be able to attack and win the game. So I may have misplayed that last turn somewhat. And I might have had a better option. So he attacks with Mace Windu, 5 damage to the base, only 2 life remaining on my base, with my opponent having Han Solo still up. So he had initially thought to attack with Han, then he's like, no, I'll attack with Mace Windu because that way if my opponent has removal that only works on non-leader units, he can't remove Han. So then I kill Han with Mace Windu, and my opponent concedes the game and shows that he did have a Han Solo in hand. So if I had played that Obi-Wan, he could have cleared him with that Han Solo and then attacked my base for lethal with his Han, unless I could kill him in 1 attack, which I wouldn't have been able to do. So I correctly evaluated that he had something waiting to get rid of that Obi-Wan, and I was able to play around it and get the win. Very, very close game, very interesting game. This also I think this also shows how, in like a 2 out of 3 situation, you kind of get some more familiarity with what your opponent's deck is doing. So, one thing I noticed, for instance, is that my opponent didn't have a very strong presence in space. So, I was thinking, okay, I am going to start with this weird, like, double restored arc start and try to push through in the space arena where I think my opponent might be unprepared and the restored arcs can get a lot of value. And then later on, I was able to go into that last turn thinking, okay, I don't think this guy has Surprise Strike. I don't think that's a card that he's playing. And because I don't think he has Surprise Strike, he just has Shoot First. And Fleet Lieutenant doesn't work on these guys, I know that he's going to be not able to kill my base in one hit. Whereas if I had seen my opponent playing 3 copies of Surprise Strike, it might have been more important for me to try and stabilize the ground arena rather than playing more things into space in order to try and prevent him from getting a potential lethal swing with that +3 damage. So interesting, very interesting matchup. We were just discussing the situations there with like he knew that I had the Obi-Wan thanks to that waylay and and was hoping to answer it with the Han, but ultimately I was able to play around it, use that Mace window instead to remove the unit that could have attacked, and ultimately get the win. Now, a little fun fact: he actually, if he had had a second copy of Mace Windu himself, he could have played it, discarded the one that was already in play, killed my Mace Windu, and ready, and then defeated my base with the next attack. But he did not have that. So very fun series of games, some nice close games, and that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, guys. And I will be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content.